The Great Lakes ATTC, MHTTC, and PTTC are funded by by SAMHSA under the following cooperative agreements. The opinions expressed in this webinar are the views of the speakers and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services and SAMHSA. The Mental Health Technology Transfer Center Network believes that words matter and uses affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented language in all activities. For more information on upcoming events, please follow the Great Lakes Mental Health Technology Transfer Center on social media or visit the website. I'll be providing those in the chat here soon. Thank you for joining us today. A few housekeeping items. If you are having any technical issues, feel free to reach out to me by email or in the chat. I'll be putting my email in there. In general, if you are having trouble connecting to audio, try turning your volume up, and then try logging in and logging out. If you have questions for the speaker, please put those in the Q&A section. The chat is open and I see people using that. However, because it might get, there might be lots of comments throughout the presentation, it's hard to make sure that we have all the questions and we can address them. Questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation, and we will try to get through all of them if possible. You can use live transcription during this presentation. At the end, you'll receive a link. I'll put that in the chat to a very brief survey and a survey for CEUs, one link. And then if you are requesting CEU certificates, those will be sent out via email to those who attend the full session within the next 2 weeks. So I will hand it over to Walaa and Jasmin. Thank you.
Hello, hello. Good morning, everyone. My name is Walaa. I am, well, you want to say your name first, then I'll share that.
My name is Jasmin Abu-Hummos.
Yeah. Well, good morning. We're super excited to be here today. Watching the chat, seeing people from Toledo and other places. So we're super excited to have everyone here. Just as a brief introduction to myself. So obviously we are talking about the Middle Eastern and North African region. So I personally am Palestinian. I am a second-generation immigrant born and raised in Toledo, Ohio. So that's my ethnic background. My religious background is I am Muslim, and my professional background is I am a social worker and a therapist. So I currently practice at Tomorrow Begins Today Consulting, which is a private practice in Toledo/Sylvania area. So yeah, that's me.
All right. Like I said, my name is Jasmin. I am also a social worker. Also, parents are Palestinian. I was born here. However, you know, very connected to my Palestinian roots. And then I'm also Muslim as well. I'm very excited to get started.
What do you do for work?
Oh, I'm a therapist, and I have my own LLC where I see Muslim individuals and then Arabic speaking individuals as well, which will help you guys differentiate between the two very shortly. So I'm going to cover objectives. Our objectives today are to develop culturally sensitive communication skills that will, help us effectively change and engage with the Muslim individuals within the Middle Eastern community. We'll also work to identify cultural nuances and sensitivities within the Middle Eastern community that may impact social work practice and interventions, and then also to gain an understanding of the political and humanitarian issues affecting the MENA region.
So before we hop into specifically talking about the Middle Eastern community, just some reminders relating to cultural competency in general. I think there's a lot we can say about cultural competency, but personally, I find these two terms to be very important. So cultural relativism is the idea that we are supposed to approach cultures not having judgment based on our own culture or a different culture. So it's just this idea, the very simple idea that cultures are different and not good or bad, they're just different. So having a comparative lens sometimes can be problematic. And I also, in college and school, you know, when we're getting our social work degrees, I think we often talk about cultural competency. It's a big term. But in the academic setting, I often learned about cultural competency. But I was actually in a presentation during my undergrad at a conference, and I heard the term cultural humility. So it just refers to the idea of, you know, I am going to gain my knowledge, and I'm going to gain my understanding and perspective, but I'm also going to continue to have this idea of humility and understand that I am teachable and not make assumptions that I know everything about a group of people just because I went to a presentation or had a client from that group before. Things like that, I think, are just so important. So yeah, I think that oftentimes when if we lack an understanding of a group of people, I think in ways we could be harmful or maybe even demonizing of their culture because we don't understand that something is a part of their culture. So today we're going to kind of do a quick synopsis of some information about the culture of these communities. But I just think that keeping in mind having that lens of coming at a culture with non-judgment and also coming at a culture with that ability to be teachable is so important.
All right, so just to kind of paint a picture for you of what the MENA region is, the Middle East, North African region. So obviously Africa and then the north of it. So we have like Morocco, Algeria, all the way to Egypt, Sudan, even Somalia. And then we have kind of other countries in the Middle East. Oftentimes these are grouped together because of just their similarities in culture, religions, and language. So many of these countries do speak in Arabic. And then certain, you know, countries, just due to colonization and whatnot, you know, for example, Algeria, you'll find they have a lot of French mixed in because they were once, you know, ruled by the French or occupied by the French. So, you know, just kind of every country has like a very different dialect. And then even within these countries, we'll find different dialects, you know, in different neighborhoods and different areas and whatnot as well. So, you know, they might all speak Arabic, but it could be a different, you know, form of Arabic or whatnot. And then as far as like religions, we do have a lot of these countries are Muslim. But then we also have a lot of Christian, we have Jewish, we have just different, you know, religions kind of throughout this whole area. And then I'm just going to jump into some definitions that'll kind of help, you know, further paint the picture for you guys that, you know, will probably come up during our conversations today. And then also things that I've seen, you know, people either misuse or something like that, and not out of, you know, just because they don't, you know, want to be racist or anything like that. It's just, you know, kind of a little bit of ignorance or something about, you know, the topic. So the first one I have on there is Islam and Muslim. I see people use these kind of in the wrong context a lot. So Islam is the religion, and Muslims are the followers of the religion of Islam. I, you know, drew as a parallel because we all know Christianity, so Islam is to Christianity as Muslim is to Christian. And then Arab is someone who is from, you know, the Middle East or North African countries that I had just shown on the previous slide. And Arabic is a language that is spoken by those people. However, you know, you could learn Arabic, but that doesn't mean you're an Arab. And you can be an Arab, but not necessarily know Arabic. So, you know, there's just knowing the difference between the two. Another term that we thought might come up is hijab, which is the head covering that we wear. And then Imam, which is a leader in the Muslim community. And then Quran, which is the scripture that we follow as Muslims.
So with acknowledgement that, as we mentioned, not everyone who is in the Middle Eastern region is necessarily Muslim. But a large population of people in the Middle East from the Middle East are Muslim. So we think kind of a very brief synopsis on the religion can be very helpful to people who may be engaging with these communities. So the word Islam actually means submission in Arabic. So it's the concept of submitting to God. So there's a belief in one God. So Islam has basically 5 basic pillars for those who choose to practice Islam. So first and foremost is what we call the Shahada, which is, the declaration or belief in one God who's worthy of worshiping. We also have Salah, which is 5 daily prayers. So those prayers are required for people who are Muslim, and they are something that needs to be done throughout the day within certain windows of time. So I think it's really important to be aware of this, really the importance of these 5 daily prayers. You may be advocating, you may be, helping a client advocate for, the right to be able to pray while they're at work. Or you may be helping a client, learn time management skills and how to work in this thing that's important to them. So I think just understanding the importance of this is very crucial to be able to adequately support Muslim clients. Or maybe if you are like a manager, being able to support your Muslim employees who might, because they legally have the right to practice this thing, whether it's a 15-minute break or however it's worked into their schedule. Also, we have zakah, which basically once a year, a Muslim gives 2.5% of their wealth to a charitable cause. So this really is the idea of equity, not just like equality. So maybe $100 is a lot of money for one person, but $100 is kind of spare change for somebody else. So that's why it's a percentage of one's income rather than just a blanket amount. And that also makes it applicable to different generations in different countries and things like that. And then also it's required fasting the month of Ramadan, which is actually the month we're currently in. So Ramadan was the month that the Holy Quran was revealed. So it is a month of really focusing on spiritual growth. And a lot of Muslims maybe even kind of use Ramadan as their like annual kind of reset, kind of in the same way maybe some people do like a New Year's resolution. It's kind of a once a year time where you get to really focus on yourself and look inward. Also, Islam has the belief of accountability. So we believe in free will and kind of a system of both reward and punishment. So we believe in accountability and everyone's right to make decisions and to be then responsible for the decisions, the results that come from those decisions. Islam is also a religion that believes in a judgment day and an afterlife. And Islam is really a set of rights and responsibilities. So every person has both rights and things, innate value and things that they have the right to within the religion, but there are also things that people have responsibilities to and things that people need to do. So as many of you may know, we actually currently are in the month of Ramadan. So I wanted to, I guess, just expand on that piece. So from dusk until dawn, which is currently from about 6:30 to about 7:30, 6:30 a.m. to about 7:30 p.m. During the month of Ramadan, Muslims fast, in which they abstain from eating or drinking water during the day, or drinking food, or drinking anything. There's a running joke where people say not even water, and we're like, yeah, not even water. So that's why I said that. But yeah, that is something that we are currently partaking in. And the idea behind fasting is if I can stop myself from engaging with something that's actually allowed and permissible, then I will learn the self-discipline to not engage with things that I'm not supposed to engage with. So it's really a time to practice self-growth, to practice gratitude for what we have, to feel for the less fortunate, and also to practice that discipline and have that spiritual growth. I think it's really important to understand the importance of Ramadan for Muslims, for practitioners. I think sometimes when people aren't familiar, especially maybe when it comes to kids, People might be kind of like shaming kids or telling them, oh, you don't have to do that, you're young, things like that. Within Islam, children under a certain age aren't obligated to partake in this, but also it might just be a part of their family practice. So it's something that's important. Obviously, if you're concerned, have a conversation with parents, but making sure that we're approaching it, again, not with the assumption that this is bad or wrong or harmful. So there is that. Also, another piece to acknowledge and be aware of is that there are exceptions to the requirement of fasting. So for example, when women are menstruating, they're not required to fast. Women who are pregnant or breastfeeding aren't required to fast. If somebody has an illness like diabetes or for a different reason, it's unhealthy for them to not eat. They are not obligated to fast. So for mental health professionals, I think that it's really important. If you are engaging with a client who has an eating disorder, I think having a conversation with them about the appropriateness of their fasting is important. And obviously you guys are not, well, everybody is not necessarily, even myself, a Muslim leader or an imam. So I guess my advice would be, if you have a concern about a client fasting because they have an eating disorder, that might qualify as one of the exceptions for fasting. So I think having a conversation with them and encouraging them to speak to an Islamic leader to get kind of a ruling on this issue can be helpful, because, obviously we would hate for somebody to kind of be making progress and then be set back because of a month of fasting and them kind of, using it to actually restrict their eating and things like that, as opposed to, the reason it's actually there. So those are some things to be mindful of.
And then just to kind of continue painting that picture for you guys, in the United States, the breakdown of people who are who do identify as Muslim, I know a lot of times when we think of Muslims, we think, oh, they're all Arab. So this kind of just really paints the picture for us that, they're not all from the MENA region, that, there's a huge percentage that are Black or African American. We have a lot from the Asian community as well. And even, a larger amount of white Muslims than we do Arab Muslims in the United States. As you can see, there's a small percentage of Hispanic and Native American and Indigenous folks, and then just a small percentage of other as well.
So another huge concept within Islam and also within MENA region cultures as well is the concept of modesty. So within Islam, there's this idea of physical, mental, and spiritual modesty. I think oftentimes when we think about modesty, we think about the physical, the way people dress, things like that, which is absolutely a factor. But there are also other factors at play. So the idea behind mental modesty is essentially kind of having humility about your intellect, having humility about what you have to offer, kind of this idea of not like being conceited and full of yourself and thinking you're better than other people, or maybe being modest about your accomplishments. Also, I think there's also spiritual modesty. So the idea of wanting to continue to grow within your spirituality, not necessarily reaching a point of stagnation or a point where you feel like you don't have to improve. And then, of course, there is that physical modesty, the way people dress, covering their bodies, things like that. For mental health professionals, I think the mental and spiritual modesty concepts are really important to understand, because I think that oftentimes, if you're not necessarily familiar with the culture, you may perceive somebody's practice of kind of modesty or undermining their experiences as kind of like shaming themselves, or not having pride in themselves. So I think just having an alternate perspective or being aware that this is a part of the culture is important. And that's not to say that sometimes people do take this to an unhealthy level in which they are maybe self-deprecating or maybe not sharing experiences that were traumatic when they should be, because they try to say, oh, it's not a big deal. So just kind of understanding the nuance of that ideology and how it can be helpful, and also ways in which maybe it can be harmful to clients. Also, as mentioned earlier, the hijab, which is the head covering that Muslim women wear. Oftentimes people ask, some people wear it, some people don't. What's that about? I always like to explain that hijab is something that is mandatory for Muslim women, but religion as a whole is a choice and is very deeply personal. So some people might practice physical modesty by only wearing long sleeves or dresses, but they might not necessarily cover their head and their hair. So people, it is something that is very personal. There are primarily three reasons that Muslim women wear hijab. So first of all is the belief that this is something that was asked of us by God. So that belief and idea of, this brings us closest to God, allows somebody to have spirituality, kind of God consciousness. And then also the physical modesty, like we discussed. And then another big reason as well is to represent ourselves as Muslim women. So having that being visibly Muslim is a big piece of this practice. Also keeping in mind that the concept of modesty in some MENA region and Muslim communities does have it so that people kind of practice more traditional gender roles. I think this is important to be mindful of and also understand that it's personal and may or may not apply to every person. Personally, we kind of were discussing some cultural competency trainings that we had been through or like learned in class and things like that. And they talk about, the MENA region or the Muslim community, and they talk about how essentially they practice traditional gender roles. And I think it's often presented in a very like rigid manner, like a nuclear family, male is in charge. I've even seen things in training saying like maybe if a couple comes in, address the man and not the woman. I think that again, maybe some of those kind of trainings or attempted cultural competency conversations are maybe demonizing and not necessarily showcasing the broad range of possibilities. So I think it's something to be aware of, but again, something that I would always advise clinicians and practitioners to approach with curiosity and really just ask questions. With that, there's also the physical boundaries between men and women. Many people who are Muslim prefer not to have physical contact with the opposite sex. So like handshakes, hugs, things like that, they won't necessarily do. And that's seen as a sign of respect of the opposite gender and also just respect for self. So I'm a really big advocate of this, not just for, this population, but for everyone. I really think that we need to normalize consent and asking. I think oftentimes we assume, clinicians aren't necessarily hugging people all the time, but in society in general, I think we assume it's okay to, tap somebody's shoulder, hug somebody, or shake their hand. But whether it's for religious reasons or different reasons, some people prefer not to do that, but I think often will allow it to happen because they are uncomfortable or they feel like, it's awkward. They don't want to say no. So I always suggest asking and having a conversation with clients to better understand, and really just people in our personal circles as well. So going off of the idea of modesty, again, I think that it's important to keep in mind that subjects like intimacy, sexuality, relationships are more considered to be subjects that are a little bit more private. So I think it's important for practitioners and clinicians to remember that this may not be a subject people are comfortable discussing. So I know personally, like in my intake or my assessment, when I see new clients, I typically ask, sexuality pronouns. I ask if they have any concerns relating to intimacy or have discomforts with intimacy. And I think oftentimes with many communities, if they seem to shy away from talking about it or have like maybe an awkward response, we might think that this is something we need to circle back to because it might be something they have an issue with. So again, I don't think there's an issue with asking in an assessment, but I think judging the way they respond with a culturally competent approach is so important. So I think maybe if it seems like it's a subject they're not comfortable touching at all, maybe just allowing that to be the case because it might not be something they want to speak to or they want to speak about. Also, I think that something else that's important to acknowledge and keep in mind is the idea of courtship versus dating. So a lot of people within both Muslim and Middle Eastern community don't necessarily date. They take what's called the courtship route in order to pursue marriage. So what this typically looks like is there is heavy family involvement from very early stages of a relationship. So because there's kind of this idea of you're not just marrying a person, but you're marrying a family. So getting to know the family is a very important piece when relationships are happening. So I think this is important to keep in mind because I think oftentimes, you know, in other cultures, meeting the family is like something that happens once you've gotten more serious, whereas in Middle Eastern and Muslim communities, it's often reversed where family involvement happens very early on. So moving beyond stigma and facilitating culturally competent healing. So I think oftentimes when we talk about stigma, it's kind of almost ironic, but I think oftentimes when we talk about stigma, we almost demonize people who have a stigma against mental health. So obviously stigma is something that needs to be addressed and worked around. But stigma exists because of shame. And so if we are shaming people for having stigma, then we're never going to be able to move forward. So there's definitely, I think, a stigma relating to mental health within Middle Eastern communities, or maybe even within Muslim communities. I think acknowledging that stigma without demonizing the culture is really important, because I think that oftentimes when people are maybe first finding, you know, I want to treat my mental health, and realizing maybe their family members don't support that, as practitioners, we don't want to be the person to be like, oh, your family's horrible for that, and kind of isolating people. So acknowledging that stigma, but figuring out ways to manage it. And I also think that looking into why that stigma exists is so important. So a big thing that comes to mind for me is the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So oftentimes immigrant populations, marginalized populations, communities of color, people are focused on surviving. So they're not necessarily in a place to think about self-actualization and to think about their mental health and their feelings and things like that. That's not something they've had the luxury of doing. So I think that stigma exists because of that. So you have kind of generational trauma passed down to people, and then now you have this person who's finally in a place where their basic needs are met, and then all of this their own trauma as well as generational trauma is kind of hitting them. So oftentimes the people we see in our offices are those people, that first person in the family who decided to pursue taking care of their mental health and things like that. I also really like discussing the idea of guilt versus shame. I think oftentimes these words are used interchangeably, but they are different. So guilt is the idea that, like, I don't really feel great about something, so I'm moved to action. I would like to do something different. Whereas shame is kind of a more extreme version of that, in which somebody is being self-deprecating, putting themselves down, having a low self-esteem, negative self-talk, that kind of thing. I think it's really important to note that within Islamic practices, the concept of guilt is seen as a sign of consciousness. So the idea is that if we don't ever feel guilty, or we don't ever feel regretful, that we won't move towards healthier, better behavior. So I think it's very unintentional, but I think that oftentimes we, even as licensed clinicians, kind of fall into this like toxic positivity mentality of anytime somebody's experiencing a negative emotion, we want to push them away from it. We want a positive affirmation our way out of something. Whereas sometimes I think it's important to hold space for that guilt, hold space for what growth can look like. And again, it's still while finding that balance and ensuring that people aren't feeling shame, but shifting maybe shame to guilt and having it be empowering. as opposed to trying to completely shift it to like, just be positive, don't put yourself down, kind of thing. An example I really like to give to that I utilize with a lot of my clients, and I think even has given me personal clarity in my life, is the ceiling and floor analogy. So I think this applies to, I typically say most parents, you know, with the exception, of course, of abusive or like really toxic or negative dynamics. So I typically would say that like your parents' ceiling is your floor. So what that means is your parents, with the capacity, knowledge, resources they have, gave you everything they possibly can. So that doesn't mean it doesn't have faults, but that means that they did their best. And that is their ceiling. And then now you have that as your floor. So you get to use what you have learned from them, kind of take the positive, leave the negative, and kind of work towards fixing those generational traumas and generational issues. I think that this is empowering because it allows people to sit with the reality of their life and the reality of maybe some negative experiences that they had as a result of their parents, without necessarily demonizing their parents as like the bad guy. And I think that it just allows for kind of an opening of one's heart for empathy and just a deeper understanding of their self, as well as their parents and ancestors and all that.
All right, I'm going to jump into incorporating spirituality into our practice. So for Muslims, and then also just people from the MENA region, religion is a huge factor for them, for, you know, their healing and their therapeutic, you know, goals and whatnot. So we really need to try to incorporate this. I think a lot of our teachings that we learn here focus a lot on the mind, and then a little bit on the body. Whereas, you know, when we're talking about religiosity, we want to focus more on the mind, body, and soul, which not a lot of our practices these days really talk about that, at least here. So, you know, just if you are met with a client who is more of, you know, from a religious background, whether it's, you know, very Christian, whether it's very Muslim, whatever, you know, way they do go, just understanding that religiosity is going to be huge in their healing process, and their therapy, you know, goals as well. So, you know, when we're building the therapeutic alliance, you know, we go into assessment and like their motivation to change, but you also want to throw in the assessment of religiosity, which I'll kind of go into a little bit more on the next slide. You know, we go into the diagnosis and conceptualization, and then we can do a further assessment on internal and external psycho-spiritual functioning. And that's where we really focus on the soul. You know, a lot of us, when we think about the soul, it's kind of like we want to really just acknowledge where impulse kind of comes in, where, you know, some people just kind of, you know, if we're just focusing on the mind and letting the mind kind of do whatever it wants, and the body do whatever it wants, we're not really honing in, like taming the soul essentially. So that's where kind of that comes in, of the psycho-spiritual functioning, and learning how, you know, their soul essentially is, whether it's kind of tamed in a way, or if it's kind of just, you know, responding to any and every impulse that's thrown their way. So to incorporate spirituality into practice, it's obviously not an easy thing to assess and quantify too, but there are tools that, you know, can help measure that. And then me personally, when I do assess my Muslim clients, obviously I ask them first, you know, if they want to integrate Islam and religious teachings into their practice, and how important that is for them. These are two tools that I've used and do use in my care. So, but I will just kind of advise that it comes off a lot better from someone who is familiar with their religion. So I obviously would not recommend that if you are not Muslim that you try to use this. It will make very little sense to you unless you have a very like deep understanding of the religion and is something you did study for for some time. So just something to kind of be aware of is acknowledging that this might be outside my scope of practice and I need to maybe do a referral in this sense. Another area where I would really recommend that we do a referral in is if we're getting a client who is not speaking the language. So if they speak Arabic or they speak, any other language, I've had a lot of clients come my way where they told me that past therapists have been using an interpreter. That honestly, like, just imagine yourself trying to explain your deepest, darkest pains, and then you have some third person in the room kind of, interpreting your feelings and whatnot to that person. The term lost in translation is the perfect description of what is going on here, because there's so much that is lost in translation. So definitely where you see fit, if there is a practitioner available nearby that does speak Arabic or the language, whatever it is, please do try to make that referral. And if you can't, just once again, be aware of all the competencies that will help, be competent with that area.
Absolutely. So yeah, I think interpreters, can be utilized in medical settings with case management, things like that. But I think the very in-depth personal discussions, trauma, conversations about emotion it's just a very significant barrier. So I always would advise, if there is an option, referring them to somebody who does speak their language. Also, Jasmin mentioned she uses these assessments because she works primarily with the Muslim community. So I personally don't work primarily with the Muslim community, so I don't use these assessments. But what I do in all of my assessments, I ask people, do you have a religion or spirituality that's important to you? And if they say yes, I try to ask at least 3 follow-up questions to gauge an understanding of what that looks like for them, to gauge an understanding of whether or not they would want this to be involved in the therapeutic practice, to gauge an understanding of if they see religion as a coping mechanism or as a stressor or both. There are just many complexities and nuances there. So I really do advise, if that's not something that's a part of the assessment where you work, I would advise that trying to add that in or have that discussion with people early on is so important. So transitioning a little bit, I think that, again, when we talk about different cultures and ways in which they are different, I think that many things that we consider to be best practices or things that are heavily researched within Western mental health are rooted in individualism and individualistic cultures, because here in the United States, we have a very individualistic culture. And it's important to keep in mind that individualistic cultures oftentimes are heavily influenced by colonization and capitalism. And majority of the people who are from the MENA region really function from a collectivistic culture place. So the idea of collective culture is kind of like looking into what is going to benefit the family, what is going to benefit society, how can I contribute to and help others. Whereas individualistic culture is more, highly focused on individual rights and individual liberties, and just kind of focusing on self. So again, I think there's kind of pros and cons either way you spin it, but it's just important to approach it with non-judgment and understand that people who come from a collectivistic culture are often going to prioritize other people maybe more than themselves or maybe equivalent to themselves. And I think it's really important that we don't, again, see that as something negative. I think oftentimes, in therapy, a huge thing we talk about is boundaries. We need to set healthy boundaries with people to be happy and to have a healthy mental health. And again, not negating the importance of boundaries, but also understanding that boundaries may look different. Sometimes when talking to a client about how their family is upsetting them or crossing their boundaries, it may more so be a conversation about what can I do to maintain a relationship with them? What can I do to kind of make it so that arguments don't escalate, rather than, what can I do to save myself and get myself out of this situation? It's just a different mentality and a different focus. So I would heavily advise, if you feel like you're working with a client who is coming from a collectivistic culture, being mindful of that in your communication with them and in the things you suggest as maybe boundaries or as coping skills.
All right, and just to kind of continue that painting for you guys, this is the statistics for Muslims who were born in the US versus those who are either not citizens and kind of in the process, or are naturalized citizens. So they essentially, work towards their citizenship once they got here. Just to kind of, show you that it is very much split. There's a lot of immigrants and refugees, and there's a lot of, those who were born here.
Oh, absolutely. So transitioning a little bit into talking about immigrants, refugees, also within that chunk of people who are born here, some of them may be second generation immigrants like Jasmin and myself, having parents who immigrated and kind of being first generation in this country. So I think it's really important. I think oftentimes when we talk about refugees, I don't think it's intentional, but I think there is this notion of, people who came from other countries because this country is better. That's oversimplifying, but I think sometimes we have that sentiment or that mentality, which can be very harmful. Oftentimes people are fleeing their countries because some type of injustice that's happening there. And many times people would prefer to live within their own home country that they are native to. So many people who are refugees have experienced firsthand trauma, whether it's due to war, whether it's due to displacement, whether it's due to financial related issues. So with that, I think they carry both trauma that they have witnessed, but also generational trauma. And again, likewise, second generation immigrants maybe didn't experience what their parents experienced, but they have that generational trauma. There also could be a lot of grief. It could be, grief actually relating to like death or loss of family members, but it could be grief of an expectation that they had of their life, or grief of, the losing their home, or losing their family that they used to be around. I also think there's a big piece of like confusion about identity for refugees, immigrants, and again, even second generation immigrants. Like I know personally for ourselves, we always kind of make the joke that, when we're here in the United States, we're seen as Middle Easterns, Arab, Palestinians. And then when we're in the Middle East, we're seen as Americans. So where do we actually fit, right? And especially for people, so that's kind of the second generation immigrant example. But for people who are refugees or first generation immigrants, that also adds an additional layer. And again, I think with good intent, I think that many, oftentimes service providers can fall into kind of this idea of forced assimilation. Maybe we think we're helping people adjust to their new life. But what we might actually be doing is stopping them from celebrating their culture and identity, or making them feel like they have to choose, when in reality, we all know that intersectionality exists and people wear many hats of many identities. That's just what makes us human and unique. So learning to celebrate that while also learning to maybe facilitate what life looks like, or facilitate what they need to feel included and safe and at home in their new homes, rather than kind of just being like, all right, you're here now, you're starting over, because that's not realistic and that's not really welcoming who they are. Also, a big acknowledgement that due to whether people are immigrants or whether they're refugees or even second generation immigrants, there is a large distrust of systems. So again, these may be people who, you know, their home countries may be colonized, their home countries may be having a war that's going on. And these things can be related to Western involvement within their countries. Also, I think, I don't know, I always think about myself, even being a second generation immigrant. If I just had to pick up my whole life and go somewhere else that's completely different than Toledo, I think that that would be really hard to adjust. And I don't think I would automatically trust people. So I think we have to, you know, practice that humility as practitioners and as clinicians, remembering that trust is something to be earned. I think big fears within the community, things relating to like being deported, well, also things relating to people's children getting taken away. I think there's a big fear of that within the community, because within Middle Eastern countries, there is not, I would say, a child protective services equivalent. Nobody can just come take your kids because they think you're not parenting them right. That's not a thing. So again, many families who are not abusive towards their children, are not neglectful, anything like that, just have this fear that just because the government or people or systems have the ability to take away their children, that's a big fear. So they may be afraid to share that they, you know, they don't want to get a bipolar diagnosis because they think that's going to look bad and they'll get their kid taken away, or they don't want to share that they're feeling really depressed because then they're scared you'll assume they're being neglectful. So that's something that's very important to be mindful of. And I even think sometimes parents whose children may even need a service won't have them in services because they are afraid of having them in a mental health service, afraid that that'll again make them, if a kid comes in and say, "Hey, my mom, is so strict," that the kid will get taken away, which again, obviously we know teenagers and kids say things that doesn't constitute abuse. But again, there is that distrust. So also understanding, I guess, taking a different perspective or a broader perspective on boundaries. Again, people who come from collectivistic cultures are a lot used to community. So the power dynamic of, I'm a clinician. We have to have very firm boundaries. I can't tell you anything about myself. That might stop people from opening up to you. So obviously within whatever boundaries you are comfortable with. But I think it's very important to keep in mind that sometimes maybe a little bit of self-disclosure to kind of humanize yourself is not always a bad thing. Or understanding that it might just take time. But there are aspects that that can look a little different. Like I think myself and Jasmin have been asked by clients before, like, "Oh, who's your dad?" Which like usually like clients aren't supposed to ask you who your father is, but that's maybe a way of connecting. And again, this doesn't mean you have to answer those questions. I even oftentimes still choose not to answer those questions, but it's just important to be mindful that that is not, them being disrespectful or nosy or trying to cross a professional boundary, but it's just them trying to seek some type of connection with you. So navigating that mindfully is so important. Talking about colonization within the MENA region. So oftentimes, I think we talk about the idea of the Middle East is like a bunch of, quote, war-torn countries, or that there's not peace in the Middle East. And I think there's kind of just this idea of very othering of different systems in different countries, and demonizing them. But I think something that's really important to keep in mind that I won't say all, because I try not to use all or nothing terms, but I think the majority of wars or political unrest within the Middle Eastern regions are due to Western colonization. So that's not just an issue that broke out because Middle Eastern people are somehow prone to not wanting to be peaceful, but Western colonization has caused these unrest within these communities. I think this is really important to keep in mind because I think sometimes, again, service providers who maybe have good intent might kind of have this almost white savior complex mentality of, these immigrants, refugees came here, this is good for them, this is what they want. but acknowledging that oftentimes people might have a lot of survivor's guilt as refugees or immigrants, because maybe they have family members who are still back home, who weren't able to flee or leave their countries, and things like that. And also keeping in mind that there is a big cognitive dissonance that comes with gaining privilege that people get when they come to this country. Because now, I pay tax dollars to a country that's contributing to a genocide in my country. Those things can be very mixed feelings. People can be happy that they're safe and healthy and okay, but they can also be feeling very guilty or confused or frustrated at, being in this new country that is racist towards them, that has caused unrest in their homeland, things like that.
All right, now we're going to jump into kind of that last objective of learning more about the political and humanitarian issues that are affecting the MENA region. I'm going to talk about issues that are kind of here at home and abroad and kind of the link between the two. First, I want to start off with Islamophobia. So Islamophobia, I want to cover the roots of it. Rather than focus on, specific incidents that occur due to it, but I will touch on kind of the barriers that it could create for, our clients. So Islamophobia is very much rooted in colonialism. It's kind of based on that dichotomy of, citizens and their colonial subjects, where they have to have like a fixed social, spatial, racial, and political boundaries that, you must live like in a democracy, or you must live in, you have to have all these different Western values for you to be successful and for you to, know peace and all that kind of stuff. Whereas, they're living just fine without, the kind of colonialistic mindset and whatnot, trying to be indoctrinated on them. And then because of Islamophobia, we do see that, this could be a barrier for some people, fearing that their practitioner will have, these views where, they think that because I'm Muslim or because I'm, from the MENA region, that you think I'm less than, or you think I'm, not civilized, or you think, I come from this war-torn country and I don't understand democracy and all this kind of stuff. Also, just kind of having to sit there that whole session and explain that, this is how my religion works, this is whatever, this is, what this means, and not actually getting into the core of what, you're actually experiencing. This can cause a lot of, added stress for that client because, they're supposed to go to their therapy session and just, be able to unload without having to educate essentially, and be the teacher in that setting. And then also just kind of a lot of people will experience, bullying and harassment in the workplace or at school. And this is, something that this is kind of the more common forms of Islamophobia that we see. And jumping into the next slide, we see that Islamophobia is very much exacerbated by the spread of misinformation and propaganda. And that, it is, in turn, it caused a very alarming rate of hate crimes in society, when, there are agencies or there are different people kind of putting out misinformation or propaganda about Muslims. So we even see this very, very common actually, where there are certain people and organizations that will try to push out anti-Islam bills. So they're kind of trying to ban like Sharia law, which is essentially just the set of practices that Muslims follow, whether they're going through a divorce or just someone passed away in their family. This is XYZ, kind of the steps that the family takes to distribute the money. That's in our law. So once again, a huge violation of our amendment rights of freedom of religion. But there are, a lot of pushes to kind of make us seem other and make us seem that we are kind of with this backwards thinking and all this kind of, nonsense that makes us look like we need to be attacked, essentially, that we are a threat to democracy and whatnot. So just kind of something to point out, and rooting back to the colonialism, the colonization piece, and that how it's, very much connected. Once you, dig in and do your research about, where the increase in Muslim surveillance happens, where there's an increase in the spread of misinformation and propaganda. The largest funders of that are people who self-proclaim themselves as Zionists. So I will, jump into kind of what Zionism is in very little, but just, something to keep in mind. But I do want to talk a little bit more about the increased Muslim surveillance. So this is something that happened almost as a response to, like I said, that the community starts to see Muslims and those, who look like Muslims as a threat to democracy. So they're saying, we need increased police security, or we need increased surveillance on these people. There have been very real incidents within our own community here in Toledo as well, where the FBI or CIA will put in infiltrators within our community to kind of get information, or to try to even villainize or push people into a corner, essentially, and get them to admit to something where they have an extreme thought or something like that, just to kind of further villainize and make Muslims look bad. So when you have a client who's kind of hesitant of sharing and feeling like they're being watched, or feeling like they're being sort of surveilled, essentially, typically we may even link that to like psychosis, where they're very like paranoid and whatnot, whereas it is a very real fear that we experience here as Muslims. And then just to kind of show who reports kind of discrimination based on their religion most, it's Muslims. So just to show that that we really do experience a lot in America, and it is a very strong push for, unfortunately, of these anti-Muslim laws, and kind of just the villainization of Muslims and whatnot. So before we jump into kind of the Zionism piece and Palestine and what's going on there, I just want to touch on some of the other political and humanitarian issues of what's going on. Being aware of this will help you become like the more culturally competent practitioner, because like I said, if you're going into a session and you have to give a whole history lesson, or you have to give a whole just kind of informational session about your religion or who you are or whatnot, that takes away from the actual practice. So just knowing that, in Syria, they've experienced a civil war, Sudan as well, a civil war, which, is now deemed a genocide as well, where over 8 million people have been internally displaced. And then along with Yemen, these are just some of a few examples of kind of what's going on. But obviously I do welcome you to kind of look into, what's going on in the different regions of your clients.
So yeah, before we hop into the next slide, we are going to be talking a little bit about the current genocide taking place in Palestine. Obviously, we are in a time of crisis. You may have been hearing about this already. We felt like this was a really necessary thing to discuss at this time. So I am going to kind of reel back and discuss some history. But I want to establish, I think sometimes the work that we do as social workers and as therapists is so heavy. So sometimes social workers kind of draw the line at politics, because we're kind of like, the work I do at work is so heavy. So when I go home, I don't really want to deal with any of that or be aware of that. But I think it's very important to remember that, unfortunately, I think that ideally, human rights should not be political by any means. But the reality of the world we live in is that human rights are political. Everything from bodily autonomy to sexuality to the marginalization of people of color, all of these things have been politicalized. Even funding for mental health agencies is politicalized. So it is important to be aware of the issues that do affect the communities and populations you work with. So again, kind of reeling back some historical context relating to what's happening in Palestine presently. So the term Zionism. So Zionism is a political movement supporting the establishment by any means necessary of a national state for Jews in historic Palestine. So Theodore Herzl would be like the father of Zionism. He wrote a book about Zionism in 1896. And there were also debates about where this homeland was going to be established. There were conversations if it was going to be in Palestine, Uganda, Argentina, Madagascar, the Sinai Peninsula. And then in 1917, there was the Balfour Declaration, which was basically issued by the British government during World War I, expressing their support of the establishment of a national home for Jewish people in Palestine. So by the early 1920s, the primary focus of Zionism shifted towards establishing a Jewish homeland within historic Palestine. So this laid the groundwork for the eventual establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. So Israel was established by ethnically cleansing and forcefully displacing Palestinians, the native ethnic people to that land. So in 1948, also known as the Nakba, which means catastrophe in Arabic, there were over about 1,500 people killed and 7,500 people displaced. And currently, Palestinians make a large majority of refugees across the world. And currently, Palestinians in the diaspora, which means Palestinians outside of Palestine, are estimated to be about 6 million refugees. So again, this is something I could not just do a whole training about, but teach a whole semester about. So we're very much summarizing, but kind of just establishing some context for those who aren't aware. So essentially, over the years, colonization has created it so that Palestinians have had less and less land to be called Palestine. So if you've never heard of Palestine or never seen Palestine on a map, that's because Palestine is currently occupied, and that is because of colonization. So if you see kind of this green that's in the image, before 1948, the entire land was Palestine, and then slowly, again, this is oversimplifying and just summarizing, but slowly more and more land has been taken from the Palestinian people. So Palestinians are either murdered or forcefully displaced from their homes, again, to establish settlements for foreign settlers. So hopping into the next slide, kind of Palestine over the years, as you guys saw on the map. So since 1948, Palestinians have experienced more and more land expulsion and ethnic cleansing. So ethnic cleansing can look like actually like murdering an entire village. It can also look like forcefully displacing people. It also can be things as simple as stealing of culture, stealing of food and kind of reclaiming it, renaming villages to be called different things, right? These are all results of colonization. So Palestinians since 1948 have been living under an apartheid system or are currently living under an apartheid system. So what this means is Palestinians, the native people to that land, are currently second-class citizens to foreign settlers. So there is a lack of freedom of movement. So Palestinian citizens and Israeli citizens have a different ID card. We personally have Palestinian ID cards. And based on the ID card you have, you are restricted, first of all, what rights you have, what court you would be tried in if you were accused of a crime, and also rights of movement. So you can't go certain places if you don't have that certain ID card. Also, it's important to keep in mind is that, or to note that the foreign settlers, so basically anybody who's anyone across the entire world, if you're somehow able to prove that you have Jewish ancestry, you are able to move to the state of Israel and take a home or take land of the native Palestinian people under the current system that's in place. So I know sometimes people talk about 1948 versus 1967. So and again, this is oversimplifying, but in 1948, chunks of land were taken from the Palestinian people, and there was almost this separate, like, this piece is for Israel and Israeli citizens, and this piece is for Palestine and Palestinian citizens. But then in 1967, the state of Israel also took control of the lands that, like we mentioned in this slide, they also took control of the green land. So while there are Palestinians living there, it is still technically under Israeli ruling. So currently, what we've been hearing a lot about in the news is Gaza. So there's currently a genocide taking place in Gaza. So since, again, just some more context, so Gaza is a part of Palestine. It's not the whole Palestine. So since 2007, Gaza has been under military siege by the state of Israel. So what that means is it is blocked by land, air, and sea. So anything that goes in or out of Gaza is only with permission of the state of Israel. So that includes like products, like things, like food and things like that, but it also includes people. So there's not, again, that freedom of movement, and there's also not an airport in Gaza.
All right, so jumping fast forward to October 7th, a lot of people like to claim that history began on October 7th, but I would like to kind of just break down and talk about context here. Is that we just discussed that Gazans have been living under siege for over 17 years, 16 years. Palestinians elsewhere have been living under an apartheid regime, where they have been subjected to just land theft. They've been subjected to kind of being kept from their families, midnight raids, you name it. It's just not a great living condition. So we're going to fast forward to October 7th, kind of, the start of this current, onslaught. The Hamas movement, which was founded in Gaza in 1987, shortly after an uprising against the Israeli occupation. Its goal was to pursue an armed struggle against Israel with the aim of liberating historic Palestine. On October 7th, Hamas, the spokesperson told Al Jazeera that the group carried out its military operation in response to the atrocities that Palestinians have faced over decades, which we kind of discussed a little bit. Very, very, very little of what they've experienced. We want the international community to stop atrocities in Gaza against the Palestinian people and our holy sites like Al-Aqsa Mosque, which Palestinians have been kept from going to worship there, and even women being beaten up, taken down by male soldiers, just as they're trying to go pray. All these things are the reason behind starting this battle, he said. The group as a whole, or in some instances, its military wing, is designated as a terrorist organization by Israel, the United States, European Union, Canada, Egypt, and Japan. However, some other countries, don't do that as such. And that's just, the claim there. So since October 7th, there have been over, and the statistic was pulled last night, I know for a fact it's much, much higher now. There have been over 3,200 Palestinians who have been killed and 7,400 wounded in the Israeli attacks. So this is always under the guise that they want to defeat Hamas. And the Israeli military has, bombed homes, schools, hospitals, bakeries, claiming that, they're trying to defeat Hamas in these areas, knowing that they are filled with civilians. They are, hospitals under international law are not areas that should be, targeted. Schools, homes, and places of commerce where people go and, buy things like bread and whatnot. So this current onslaught has displaced 2 million people. And then if, we think about the map of Gaza, they were all the way up in the south, in the north, and they were just told, hey, there's these safe zones that you can go to as we try to target Hamas. So you go down, this route. And as they're going in these routes, they were bombed, they were targeted. Many people were killed, kind of trying to seek safety as well. And then once they go to those areas, few weeks pass by and they're like, okay, this area is now going to be, targeted as well. So they kind of just now are all the way, at the border of Egypt now, where there's about 1 million people kind of in makeshift camps, where they're living in tents, and they've, are facing starvation as Israel has cut off all food, water, and electricity for a very long time, and have been slowly letting it in now. But it's, on a typical day, Gaza used to receive about 500 aid trucks. They're now getting about like 2 every like 10 days. It's it's really it's just a man-made famine that's going on right now. There's been forced starvation. They're also targeting medical personnel and journalists. There's been a very alarming rate of journalists who have been targeted in this, as well as medical personnel. I would advise you all to kind of look into a Shifa hospital right now. The events occurring there are, unspeakable. It is a live stream genocide that we are seeing right now. It's been brought to the International Court of Justice by South Africa. They are essentially, the International Court ruled that Israel is plausible for genocide. That means they're, likely to be committing it. And they were advised to kind of stop their actions, lower their attacks and whatnot. And they have in turn just done the opposite. They've cut off funding to the only relief agency that was allowed to go in. So they are just making it, worse and worse. Because of this, we've seen a global support for a ceasefire and Palestinian liberation. So we just want, essentially the bombing to stop so that people can get aid in, so that people can get, treated, people who need to be evacuated can evacuate, and just, essentially not have to live in fear of being bombed. And due to this, we've seen an uprising in Islamophobic and anti-Arab sentiment just all over the world.
So why it matters to you? I think first and foremost, I think as social workers in general, I think any type of suffering or injustice is something that should matter to us. Also, keeping in mind that the United States is directly involved in this issue. So the United States is considered an ally of the state of Israel. So US tax dollars are being used to fund this genocide that's happening in Palestine. And the United States government currently does support Israel's right to defend itself, which kind of is concerning because it obscures the disproportionate use of force against Palestinians and legitimizes violence and aggression under the guise of self-defense. I think it's really important to talk about the concept of like manufacturing consent. So oftentimes, well, not oftentimes, countries and governments don't come out and say, hey, we want to colonize this group or we want to kill all these people because we're racist. That's not what governments say. Governments find a way to demonize a group, which normalizes violence against them. And that is what we're seeing happening in the United States. And again, being very mindful of the fact that you may have clients who are involved in activism. You may have clients, there are multiple families in Toledo who have lost tens of family members in Gaza. So just thinking about the level of trauma that people are, clients are exposed to. And I also like to draw attention to the fact that regardless of if people are from this region or not, a genocide happening live streamed in 2024 is traumatizing for everyone. So it doesn't necessarily just affect people of this population, but it really does affect everyone. Also, I guess, continuing to remember that this issue did not begin in October, and the root cause of the current violence taking place in Palestine is 75 years of occupation, settler colonialism, and ethnic cleansing. Also, something to be mindful of is that with this kind of anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab sentiment that is going on, some people who are pro-Palestinian liberation are facing accusations of terrorism or anti-Semitism. So obviously the term terrorism is often used to demonize people of Middle Eastern backgrounds. And furthermore, the idea that calling out colonization is somehow anti-Semitic is extremely dangerous. So anti-Zionism does not equate to anti-Semitism. And I think that is especially important for those who are identify as Jewish and also identify as anti-Zionist. So a genocide taking place in the name of all Jews can be very harmful to those Jewish people who don't believe in that and who are standing against that. So yeah, one of the loudest pushes for a ceasefire currently in the United States is an organization called Jewish Voice for Peace. So that's important to keep in mind. So we wanted to end off by talking about activism and empowerment. So I think that sometimes, again, I don't think that it is intentional, but I think that when really atrocious, horrible things are happening, and maybe we as clinicians aren't educated on an issue and we don't know what to do, I've seen a lot of things on social media and also heard people in my personal life as well as clients talking about other service providers saying things like, you know, you just need to take care of yourself. These images are distressing. You don't need to look at them, things like that. And I also kind of want to remind as therapists, when we are trying to help somebody with their mental health, we don't typically encourage denial or avoidance. And choosing to look away from a genocide that's taking place that negatively impacts us all is a form of avoidance. So I would encourage this idea of looking away, I think is also kind of like chipping away pieces of our humanity. And I really think that challenging alternative perspectives to self-care, so things like being involved in activism, finding your voice, learning to become comfortable about your identity, not shying away from having conversations, making sure that we're uplifting and empowering clients to do this rather than being like, oh, you should just not be involved in that. It's not good. I've even heard, I think validating experiences is really important. I've heard of clinicians saying things like, well, we don't really know what's going on over there. So, you know, it's kind of good to stay out of it, things like that. I think we all have a duty to educate ourselves. And furthermore, if a client is coming to you and saying, my people are affected by this, my family's affected by this, I'm affected by this, who are you to invalidate their experience? I also kind of really just want to talk about the link between desensitization, dehumanization, and the normalization of violence. So the more we normalize, like when we say things like, oh, well, that's just a war-torn country, or those two groups of people have just been fighting forever. No, what's happening is a genocide. In 2024, there's a genocide happening and it's being live streamed and people are watching it on social media. Again, this is traumatizing for everyone. This is not normal. So when we normalize violence against certain groups of people, we are engaging in dehumanization, which innately contributes to violence against those people, both abroad and in this country. And again, keeping in mind that violence abroad and violence in this country affect people in this country. So again, empowering clients to find their voice. So if somebody comes and says like, you know, I kind of feel this way, but I feel hesitant about talking about it because I'm scared or whatever. I think sometimes, you know, again, well-intended but misguided clinicians might kind of just be like, okay, if you're uncomfortable talking about it, you don't have to. But rather facilitating a safe space where people feel like they can talk about something is important. Also, again, I've seen a sentiment of neutrality, again, within mental health professionals and kind of the wellness industry of just like, you know, not picking a side and things like that. Again, I think it is very harmful. So as we all know, when there is a system of oppression going on, you are either supporting the oppression or you are against the oppression. And when you choose to do nothing, you are complicit in the oppression and you are contributing to it. So I, again, would not advise clinicians saying things to clients like, it's almost undermining to their intellect when we say things like, oh, well, you know, you don't need to have an opinion on this, things like that, but rather it's important to explore what their opinion is. So yeah, again, just keeping in mind that when we engage in things like neutrality, we are kind of engaging in villainization and victim blaming, and also having, I think, just very selective compassion, because I think that when atrocities have happened in other places in the world, people are quick to hop on empathy for it. But when it's happening in the Middle East, people are like, oh, that's controversial. So again, I just think being mindful of these things and being mindful of the way we communicate with clients on these things is so, so important. So yeah, that is mostly it for us. We do have our contact information on here. So I'm going to leave this up and open the floor for questions. I believe Elijah, maybe you're looking at the Q&A and kind of
Yes,
helping summarize some.
yeah, I just want to say thank you for really good information. I think one of the things that really stuck out to me and something I've been discussing recently is that whole kind of positive mental health, positive thinking, and like we should get rid of distressing anything. And so I really appreciated your views and sharing that because that's something I've been thinking about recently. Like our job isn't really to get rid of all things distressing because as behavioral health professionals, we know those things will come.
Yeah,
Distressing thoughts, distressing situations will come. It's really about our our job is really to help clients work through that distress. And um, so I really appreciated that. And I think, you know, I really appreciated also your, framing this like, I thought back to not that this is the same thing, but well, anytime we see kind of this a horrible thing on TV that's live streamed and shown over and over and over again, I think like, I remember um the death of George Floyd. And we're not meant to we're humans aren't meant to see that constantly replay. So yeah, this kind of stuff does affect all of us. So thank you. There are a few questions. One question was on one of the slides. Could you clarify some of the numbers? This was a few slides ago. It said numbers in the thousands, but you had mentioned hundreds.
Oh, the death toll.
It might have been.
yeah, we can do that.
Sarah, if you can chime in and clarify which slide.
I think this is the slide.
Yeah, I think so.
So the numbers are here on here are the accurate ones. I think we might have, I don't know if we read them wrong.
Misread.
Talking.
So, okay.
I
Then
think the unfortunate part is it's a really big number. And so
yeah.
I think that, yeah.
It's also not up to date, like I said. This was as of last night, and I know for a fact it's much higher now.
Also, keep in mind about the numbers that are publicized are the numbers of identified bodies. So this does not take into account missing bodies as well as bodies that are still stuck under the rubble of bombed infrastructures. So it is, honestly, I have heard like 4,500. I've heard that number. We wanted to use the most like referenceable number. But many people do say that the number is likely a lot higher.
It also doesn't include those who have passed away from famine, being starved to death, and also those who have not been able to access healthcare. So let's say you were someone on dialysis, just due to, the collapse of the medical systems, those people have been unable to access those things. So they have been, where medical reasons is the reason they passed away. It's in turn it is because of this. It's because of Israel's blockade.
Earlier, this was early on in the presentation, but it was how do you respect how do you respectfully gender boundaries how do respectful gender boundaries play out when working with young men as a non-Muslim? How can or non not someone who's practicing Islam, how can we appropriately gauge and teach leaders for older teen boys who practice Islam?
Yeah. So I don't know if the question was like a female clinician or just asking about teen boys in general.
It might have been a female clinician.
Okay, yeah. I think that just being mindful of the fact that maybe there will be an expectation of certain boundaries and having conversations with the family about what that looks like. And I also think specifically when it comes to children or minors, having conversations with the parents to establish trust and context is really important. I know with teenagers, it's always a touchy subject because we want the kids to trust us. So we want to be cool. We want to, not overshare with parents, which of course is important, but keeping in mind that family orientation is like a big part of their culture. And keeping in mind that family involvement is important. Some people will choose, if they're female, they only want to see a female clinician, or if they're male, they only want to see a male clinician. But there also are people who are willing to see. So I just think it depends. And I think that, obviously if somebody's already your client, then they're already your client. But if, you are in a facility that has the option of, has a diverse, amount of clinicians having conversations about, like, in whether you have like intake processes or consultations, however your practice or where you works, having a discussion about, like, do you have a preference of the gender of the clinician? Can you think of anything else for teenage boys? The points. Okay.
Thank you. I think one of the nice things I took away is, and maybe you can clarify, and maybe the takeaway is wrong. And if you have any questions, we still have time, and then you can put those in the Q&A. But it really comes down to like learning here, learning other places, remaining curious, and asking questions. Because I think, we unfortunately our language becomes really cumbersome when we're always saying, well, it's not everyone, it's not all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, like, so unfortunately we say, like, these people, obviously we're not talking about everyone, every single person in that region, maybe a big group of them. And then even when I always talk about, like, when we do these cultural competency trainings, and you were talking about this earlier, someone says something, and that might be true for some people, some families, but it's not true for all of them. And so it's about continuing our learning and being curious and open and asking questions.
Absolutely. And I think it's also about figuring out, like, what these things look like in practice versus on paper. And so I think that, yeah, kind of being mindful of the potential of differences, but also, like, in learning about it in kind of academic sessions or spaces or presentation spaces, can be helpful sometimes to understand, like, the back end of things, like when we explain the religious aspect, like why this is done, things like that. And then again, in engaging with clients, you get to see firsthand what that looks like, or how it may be different than you may have assumed the first time you've heard it.
Yeah. And this last question is kind of a big question. So maybe I think it might be good, as we send the slides stuff out, if you could provide, like, where can people continue to learn? I think that's what most people who come to trainings like this want to learn. So where can we continue our learning so we can better serve the clients who we might come in contact with?
I know there are some, like, schools that teach, like, Islamic psychotherapy. The one I'm doing a training with personally is the Khalil Center. So KHALIL center. I think it's .com. I know they have a lot of good stuff on, like, the cultural competency and dealing with, the MENA region, and then specifically Islamic psychotherapy. So that I would definitely recommend. But as far as, like, learning about kind of the region, the kind of humanitarian and political things that are going on, just follow sources like, I think, Al Jazeera, because they're, there, on the ground and whatnot. There's, so many different, sources too that we can share, through email if we want after here, so that we can, get those out to you guys. You can continue learning.
Yeah, we can definitely compile those. Specifically relating to current events, I always talk about the importance of following primary resources. I think we need to look into other things to understand historical context and things like that, but primary resources, there are journalists on the ground in Palestine currently, things like that that are reporting, so that's really helpful. And then there's also, what's the name of the agency that kind of helps with the Middle Eastern community? The social services. No, social services for the Arabic community. That was one program too. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
That's usually
yeah, there's an agency called Social Services for the, is it for the Arabic community? That provides resources to people. So just like as a referral source, if you ever need for like case management kind of resource connection. And then of course for therapy, like we mentioned, we are both therapists and accepting clients. So we're open to being contacted or reached out to for referral purposes. But yeah, I think maybe we can add some kind of educational resources onto this and get it sent out.
And then there's also NAMI, they have a MENA chapter as well. They're the only ones that we get to have here in Toledo. So definitely, utilize them as
Yeah.
well.
Definitely check out local resources. But again, this webinar was broadcasted to 6 states, so maybe not
Right.
not everyone has access to that, but
I don't know what you guys have in other states. I'll look.
but check around, and thank you again for Walaa and Jasmin for your presentation. Thank you again to attendees. If you have not gotten a chance to do the evaluation, that'll be sent out by email. You'll receive a Zoom email tomorrow as a follow-up from Zoom, like you received the link, and at the end they'll have the evaluation, and then I'll be following up with CEU certificates and whatnot after. So have a wonderful day, everyone. Happy Social Work Month. Happy spring. I know it doesn't feel like spring, but the calendar says it's spring. So have a wonderful day, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.